again, internets. This is Justin with Justin Security. This video is the final part of a 3-part series on the network scanner Nessus. First, let's get started by opening Nessus again. If you're following along, we did create a desktop shortcut, so I definitely recommend maybe taking a look at the other video if you haven't. If you don't want to, it's in your start menu under Tenable. When we last left off, we finished our scan, and now we are left to interpret our scan results. Before we interpret our scan results, it's probably a good idea to talk about the metrics that Nessus follows, actually which most network scanners follow. Nessus uses the standard rating system called CVSS version 3. It's a common vulnerability scoring system. It is based on different impacts the vulnerability has on a system. The severity of the impact raises the vulnerability score and is calculated using a complex system. It's used by quite a few other scanning programs to assess vulnerabilities on a system. I'm sure you've noticed already, but Nessus uses something called plugins. Plugins are essentially what virus definitions would be to an antivirus. The difference being is that we could actually go to that plugin ID, find out what it does, find out what the vulnerability is, and actually find a way to remediate the problem that the vulnerability is causing or potentially causing. Before we start our analysis, let's go ahead and export and save our data so that we can look at it at another time if we needed to. To do that, we want to go ahead and navigate to the upper right-hand corner, select Export. We want to highlight HTML. We can use some of these other ones, but HTML is going to be the easiest, most widely distributed format that we can save this in. So we'll go ahead and select HTML. We can probably do a custom report, but we'll just do executive summary. It shows quite a bit of information as it is, and go ahead and download it. It will ask you to, of course, save that file. We'll go ahead and save that file. I'm going to save it to my desktop. Feel free to save it wherever you'd like, and then I'll go ahead and, of course, name it Basic Scan and save it to my desktop. Alright, now let's talk about our basic scan. As you can tell just looking at the initial basic scan, we have some interesting components. First, we have our host, and then we have our vulnerabilities. Our hosts are our devices that we've used. We entered an IP address range, and like I said, I mentioned mine might be a little weird. This is my IP range. Looking further up, we can actually look at the vulnerabilities as a whole and the history of our scans. You may, at times, do more than one scan, likely that you will if you decide you like Nessus, but the history, it is a good little record of the scans that you've done, and you can go ahead and reference them just so long as you have Nessus installed on your computer still. Alright, so now let's take a look at our scan details on the right side. It just basically gives us a synopsis on the scan that we've done. We have name, status, policy, scanner, folder, start, end, time elapsed, and then of course our targets. Moving on down, we have a little vulnerability wheel right here. As you can see, it is shaded by color. Each color shade basically describes the severity of the vulnerability that your system is susceptible to. We can see that it starts from blue and goes to red. Each color represents a different severity level, and these severity levels are directly related to the CVSS that we initially talked about in the beginning of this video. Now, there are two colors that the CVSS doesn't necessarily recognize as threat levels, and that would be blue and red. These are essentially created by Nessus. They are their own security level warnings. Let's go ahead and briefly talk about each severity level and what they do and what they represent. Blue isn't numbered, it's info. It's basically a mixed bag of data. Some of it is just data letting you know that people can do a trace route on your system, for example, which anyone can do. Other times you'll get info that in theory could lead to a vulnerability. And of course it's important to assess these case by case because there are too many to look at in our example. A good Google search can go a long way when looking at these. Green is where we start our numbering. It would be low, 0 to 39 on the ranking system. In many cases, these are theoretical exploits. They usually haven't been used, but there is, of course, potential for it. Yellow would be our medium, 4 to 6.9 on our rating scale. A bump from low severity, still unusual exploits that are more difficult to perform, obviously more possible than the lower threats. We have orange, which is high. The The range from that is 7 to 10. High means there's an exploit and you better fix it. Usually it means that the vulnerability is extremely common and that there are easy methods to exploit said vulnerability. And the last is critical. It technically falls within orange. It is 10. Critical means that essentially, once again, you need to fix this. Probably something almost that cannot be fixed without changing systems, for example, like upgrading from Windows XP to Windows 7. Other times, a 10 could actually mean that a exploit was found by an organization, but they have so little data that we do not know whether or not to label it as critical or not. So Nessus essentially says that it is a 10 until otherwise notified by the said company. Alright, let's go ahead and analyze our scan that we performed finally, now that we kind of have an idea of what a lot of this data here represents. Alright, let's take a look at the hosts first. As you can see, I have my router, my actual computer, my host computer, the one that I'm using right now. This is my Windows XP machine, and this one is my Windows 7 machine. To start, let's go ahead and navigate to the first vulnerability page on our first host. Let's go ahead and click it, and it will open up a big window of information letting us know what exactly the plugin is and the plugin family and how many vulnerabilities are on the system. So we can go ahead and dig deeper, check out what the plugin has to tell us. It basically gives us a description of the vulnerability, a solution. Some may not have a solution, so you got to be aware of that. But almost always you'll notice that there is some kind of extra information that you can go out and do some digging on. Let's go ahead and navigate back to our scans and select the next host. This host is me, actually. This is my computer. This is the vulnerabilities it has picked up. And honestly, it doesn't look like it picked up very much, does it? I see an Ethernet card manufacturer detection, a local network DNS detection, Nessus scan information. Not very much data. That's a good thing. It brings a good point to having an updated system. I pretty much religiously keep my system updated. I make sure what the updates are coming onto my system before I let them on, and that's probably why my machine is a little bit vulnerability free. For the purpose of this video, I actually had to find a machine that I could display a extremely high vulnerability on. I had a hard time with other machines, so I figured I might as well just show what an XP machine looked like. And this is kind of what I really wanted to show mostly. So let's go ahead and navigate to the vulnerabilities of our Windows XP machine, which is the 192.168.2.13. This particular vulnerability looks like it actually allows for a remote access to the system, essentially some kind of backdoor access. The solution, it says Microsoft has released a set of patches for Windows 2000, XP, 2003, Vista, and 2008. What that means is you need to update your system, whether it be by actually updating Windows or buying a new Windows, which in this case I would definitely recommend. I mean, XP is really old and you can get some cheap versions of Windows 7. While we're still in the XP vulnerabilities area, let's take a look at the second vulnerability, the second top vulnerability that we found, MS09001. It looks like this particular vulnerability actually is susceptible to a denial of service against the host remotely. Once again, it seems like the solution is to update your system. You can, of course, look at the data that Microsoft has compiled on it. Another good bit of information to note is on the right side of the vulnerabilities page. It gives you a lot of plugin information, risk information, vulnerability information, and lastly, exploitable with. This is very interesting because it tells you what can exploit this particular vulnerability. I'm not sure whether or not it's good or bad, but it's good to know, I guess, where the attack would be coming from. We won't be taking a look at the last machine because it's basically a repeat of the last three. Instead, I'd like to go ahead and compare a scan that I performed, an advanced scan that I performed versus our basic scan. You'll definitely notice some differences, and I guess it'd be up to you whether or not those differences would help in deciding whether or not you should move to advanced and create your own scan. Instead of showing you how to open your scan that we exported, I figure you can do that on your own. We'll go ahead and pull up my basic scan that I performed on the left and my advanced scan that I performed on the right. Taking a look at the very top near the table of contents, we see our host summary. They're not entirely different, as you can tell, but they definitely we have more devices scanned on our advanced scan. In the scan, there were two options that I chose that essentially allowed me to view the names of my devices, at least if I had named them, that is. On the right, you can see my named devices. We have my Epson printer, we have my computer, which I've named Robotron 5000, and we have my Windows 7 PC, which I have named. Once you go through the majority of these and pair them up with each of their corresponding host names, you'll realize that there isn't much of a difference with the exception of our Epson printer. We can go ahead and navigate down to our Epson printer on our advanced scan, and we actually notice that there's a high vulnerability on this. Had I not scanned for this, I would have never known that we have some issue with our printer. And what it's telling us here is that our name for our printer is the default. Usually a printer, at least a newer printer, will allow you to create a print server. Essentially, that's what our printer has done without us asking. And then unbeknownst to us, it set it as a common default public name. So anybody that knows that a Epson printer is Epson CA3B2 is exploitable in this manner, they can probably escalate privileges onto my network, onto whatever system that I am trying to protect. So already I believe that, in my opinion, the advanced scan has already won out the basic scan based on this particular setting. This particular instance also reminds me that not every network is going to be the same. Thus, you need to be aware of what is on your network and what's going on it. Otherwise, things like this will happen. I didn't think there would be any issue with my printer, but I decided to throw it on the network, and hey, looky there. Now I have an exploit that I need to plug. I wanted to go on and explain a little bit more about hardening, but unfortunately the video already is running pretty long as it is. But I would say that the best method for hardening so far that we've seen has been to make sure your system is updated, make sure you're not running an outdated system like Windows XP, for example, and finally, know what's on your network. These three recommendations aren't necessarily really even coming from me. They're essentially coming from Nessus. All the scans that we've performed, I've scanned on a pretty decent range of devices, and I can probably say that some of them I honestly didn't expect. Obviously, I expected the Windows XP machine to be vulnerable, but I did not expect my router to be vulnerable, and I did not expect my printer to be vulnerable. Another thing I'd like to point out is that I assumed that my Windows 7 would probably be the most vulnerable. I loaded it up with as much junk as I possibly could, spyware, spam, whatever I could find. Nessus didn't pick any of it up, interestingly enough. And that is because Nessus is not an antivirus or an anti-malware. It is a network vulnerability scanner, and that is its job. It does it very well, but do not expect it to remove your viruses. Alright, well this concludes our video series in exploring Nessus and how to use it on a home network. Hopefully this was informational for you. I know it was for myself. If you like my videos, hey, go ahead and subscribe to me. That'd be cool. Otherwise, hey, have a nice day and keep your network safe.